Hey guys, welcome back to another Gaming Memories video. Here we are actually taking a look at an original concept or prototype for Resident Evil 1.5. This was the early version of Resident Evil 2 that was in production up until it was abandoned in early 1997, and it was replaced with the game that we actually got, that we all know and love today, which has since gone on to be remade in 2019 under the Resident Evil 2 remake. But there's a lot of reflective elements that were taken from the likes of this original prototype that became a permanent fixture in the final version of Resident Evil 2 and even in the remake over the last number of years. The main difference is with the game is the locations in the game were different, with the likes of the police station or the RPD station. In 1.5, the police station was actually more modernised based around that time period, whereas in the final game the police station was actually based in an old museum, which kind of tries to stick with the concept of Resident Evil in general, because Resident Evil, the entire franchise, as we all know, was based around the likes of old creepy vintage style buildings and mansions. So the police station Resident Evil 2 definitely reflects that element. But one of the main reasons why 1.5 or the Resident Evil 2 prototype was cancelled originally is that Capcom weren't happy with the direction of the franchise, as the story didn't really fully lead on from the original game, and it didn't really tie into it as such to a point where we would actually be able to continue on the story later into the franchise, as we've seen over the last 25 years with loads of different spin-offs and even direct sequels where they've been able to continue on the story. They were afraid that this game would have been the end of the franchise, and they didn't want it to be like that because they could see the potential from the first game, and they realised that they had something here that could literally go on for years and become one of the biggest and most popular gaming franchises in history, which it clearly is and has been for a very, very long time. And I know myself from being a mega fan of Resident Evil, because the original game is my favourite game of all time. I do remember actually going back and reading tons of magazines and actually seeing screenshots of these early prototypes, and it's well known that if you go and look online, I'll even drop links in the description to resources and websites that actually talk about this a lot and actually talk about all that news in more detail. You used to be able to find a lot of previews and articles in game magazines around the early developments of Resident Evil 2, and a lot of the information and screenshots that usually came up at that time were of the original 1.5 prototype. But then obviously things changed, so at the time you didn't really think about it as such. I know myself, you didn't. You were just that excited to get to play Resident Evil 2. If I'll be honest, actually, after Resident Evil 1, the most anticipated game for me ever, that I've ever been more eager to play, was Resident Evil 2. I could not wait to play it. But due to that eagerness, and the fact is back then we didn't have access to the internet. This was like back in 1996, 97, 98. Very few people had access to the internet, so the only chance you actually had of being able to find out any information really about games was literally just through games magazines or articles that you could find anywhere pretty much. So you didn't really pass much remarks so much as to the likes of what was available. All you just knew is that you were going to play Resident Evil 2. It wasn't until the game was further on in development, and then when you got to play the Resident Evil 2 preview demo that actually was packaged with the Resident Evil Director's Cut back in late 1997, it was only then you realised that this was actually different from all the other screenshots that you'd actually seen, and then it left wondering what happened to that original concept. And the game was actually nearly finished. It was about between 70 and 80% complete by when they decided to scrap it, because again they didn't like where the elements of the story were going. But not only that, if you compare it graphically, even as you can see here on the screen compared to the game that was released, you can see there's a lot of differences in terms of the graphics, even with the likes of the characters. Even when you look at the likes of Leon in 1.5 compared to the way he looked in Resident Evil 2, they definitely used a lot more power from the PlayStation console itself, because at the time Resident Evil 2 was considered to be one of the best looking games on the console, and more or less it still is. because he used a very high polygon count and you could actually see the facial features of the characters. So a lot could be said for it. Now, it's not to say that the original concept of 1.5 was a bad looking game. It was actually a phenomenal looking game, but graphically on the characters and the 3D models themselves, and even in the enemies, probably wouldn't have been as good to the final game. But there was a lot of elements in the original game, and the same can be said even with the change of characters for the female characters, the likes of, we got Claire Redfield in the original game, whereas in 1.5 you had Elsa Walker. So Claire ended up replacing Elsa Walker because they wanted to find a way to be able to tie the story in with the original concept and how they could bring it forward. So they had to make a lot of changes in order to achieve that result. But not only that, there were a lot of other elements in the game itself that were very, very different. In terms of even the enemies, you had different kind of like characters or enemies, like you had even bigger, like broader kind of style zombies, different shapes and sizes, but zombies could move a lot quicker after you as well. But not only that, when you shot enemies or if you took damage yourself, you could visibly see damage on both characters. So you could actually see blood splatters and you could see different elements actually portraying on the character. But not only that, even on the environments themselves as well, like blood would actually could splatter on the walls and so forth, but that didn't or wasn't reflective in the final game, which is a pity. But I suppose it was just some of the things, in order to make the game graphically as good as the original game was, they definitely had to take out a lot of elements from what they had been testing in the original game. Now, over recent years, and even this version here that I'm playing is just literally a fan prototype that's been put together. Now, it's the only version that I could actually get my hands on to actually play it, and it was the only version that I could actually get to work. But still, for me, I don't care. It's a privilege to be able to actually get to play an original piece of gaming history that has never really seen the light of day, and the fact is that we actually have the ability to do so, and that so many fans have actually taken their time and dedication to be able to piece it together in the way that they actually have is quite incredible. And it does give access to so many fans of Resident Evil 2 to be able to actually experience that for the first time. So it's definitely a great achievement, and for me it's a privilege like to be able to play it. So I highly recommend, if you can get access to it, I highly recommend that you just go and have a look at it. But even when you look at the actual aesthetics of the backgrounds and stuff, like even for the original concepts, even though a lot of it was scrapped, there was certain elements, like even the music and certain things that were actually left in the original game. But I still think, and I remember looking back to the magazines, yes, the graphics on the backgrounds, a lot of it is very kind of like more or less like a grey style colour, but it's very modern for that time period, and if anything it actually looks really, really cool. And in a lot of ways, in my own personal opinion, in some ways it actually has its own eerie feeling, and it is actually scary in its own right. Even though Resident Evil 2, the final version that we actually did get, is considered to be one of the best horror games ever made, and it's considered to be, alongside Resident Evil 4, the most popular Resident Evil game. But this game definitely holds its own in most respects, considering what's actually there. And it is creepy in its own right. So they did manage to take what was there in this prototype and manage to bring it into the subsequent games, like of the Resident Evil 2 that we got, even Resident Evil 3. So that was one thing that they did actually get right. But again, it's just a privilege to be able to actually play it. And the fact is that we can actually play as both characters. So you can play as the early version of Leon Kennedy, and you can actually get to play as Elsa Walker. So it is actually pretty cool. The fact is you can get to roam around a lot of those environments, even though in this version here the doors and the areas don't always lead exactly to where you'd expect them to go. But again, it's just the very fact that fans have been able to even piece this together and actually get it to work to some degree is actually quite incredible. And the very fact is that you can even play it in any way, shape or form is really an achievement in itself. And like I said, I highly recommend that you actually do go and give it a try. Like, you've got absolutely nothing to lose, and I highly recommend that you really do have a look into it, especially if you want to experience a lot of the history of Resident Evil. And now with Resident Evil currently is recording this video being on its 25th anniversary, now is the perfect time to re-explore a lot of those old classic games and even try and access this prototype as well. You can find it online if you go looking for it, and just play it and see what you think, and even compare it to the final version of the game that was released. I am going to be doing another video soon, and I'm going to compare both of the games pretty much side by side and just share my thoughts and experiences and just opinions with everyone, see what you think for yourself, because it is good to see the contrast and the comparisons between each of the games and to see the changes and where it actually eventually led to. But that still doesn't take away from this original prototype. Even by today's standards, this would still be an incredible version of the game to play if Capcom actually ever did decide to release it. Even though they've clearly admitted that they don't want to even go back to that. But if they ever did, at least they know they have something there that they can work with. Even just to bring it up to modern standards so that you can play it on modern consoles. Even if they used it even as a spin-off, it'd still be an incredible achievement. So now would be a perfect time to play it. So I highly recommend you go and hunt it down and go and try it out and see what you actually think for yourself. But if you actually have played this version of the game, I'd love to know your thoughts on it and what did you actually think of it. Did you enjoy it? And even so, what are your thoughts of it compared to the Resident Evil 2, the final version of the game that we originally got? Be sure to share it down in the comments below. So if you have enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more retrospective style content like this here based off other type of prototypes and games that were released on the PlayStation or that were in development that you would have liked to have seen and get the chance to play, make sure to leave a like on the video. Also make sure to subscribe to the channel and again hit that bell icon to be updated of future videos. And also be sure to check out some of the videos on the channel as well related to other games in the Resident Evil series and even other survival horror games that were released on the PlayStation. So as always, make sure to keep playing those classic games and enjoying them, and keep those gaming memories alive.